The social safety net here in the US is much thinner than it is in many other countries. And so there are a lot of people who are going to be really attracted to someone who says, let me give you a place to stay. And then if you just are in the building because you've been given free housing, you're just that much more likely to be roped in.
The Aggressive Christian Missionary Training Corps was, well, a lot like it sounds, a militaristic evangelical cult with an incredibly dark history, led by a woman who claimed to have divine visions. Our guest today is Harrison Hill, the author of the new book, The Oracle's Daughter, The Rise and Fall of an American Cult, that follows the life story of the leader's daughter, her daring escape, and her life in the wake of ACMTC. For this episode, Harrison tells me the story of this new religious movement that began in the 80s, how it formed, what its believers believed, and what their spiritual and political goals really were. And just a heads up, although we avoid talking in detail about the profound abuses that the leaders committed, including against children, please be aware that this episode may be difficult for some listeners. Together, Harrison and I discuss the nonlinear process of cultic self-deprogramming, the mystery of the grifter versus the true believer, and how the story relates to where we are today. I'm your host, Chelsea Weber-Smith, and this is American Hysteria. I am so excited to talk with our guest today about what is a pretty outrageous, pretty harrowing story of kind of a more modern day new religious movement, cult. You know, there are many words for it, but we're going to really get into it today. So Harrison, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Chelsea. I'm very excited to have this conversation.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a really, really valuable conversation, and definitely one that has a lot of pain involved in it, and a lot of the kind of militancy that we find spurs some of the most dangerous types of groups. So I would love to just start our conversation by hearing about how you came across this story, because I know it was otherwise pretty unknown, and you came into it in a pretty serendipitous way.
Yeah. To the point of it being kind of unknown, it's funny, whenever I mention the cult at the middle of this book, the cult is called the Aggressive Christianity Missions Training Corps. People always tell me, quite a title. People tell me, oh, I've never heard of that group. And I say, I know, that's why I wanted to write a book about it. But yeah, the book is called The Oracle's Daughter, The Rise and Fall of an American Cult. And I came to the story, again, as you said, in a pretty serendipitous way. I live in Brooklyn, New York. My younger brother used to live in Brooklyn as well with his wife. And one day their ground floor apartment flooded, and their next door neighbor was a very kind woman who came over and helped them clean up the flood. And after that happened, they, of course, became friendly, as you do. And as the weeks and months went by, this woman started to reveal more about her life. And eventually she revealed that she had grown up in a cult that had been run by her mother. My brother and his wife were, of course, very interested in that. And they, of course, knew that I'm a writer and that I'm always looking for interesting stories. And so they came to me and they said, I really think you should meet this woman named Sarah Green. She has a remarkable story. And I, of course, was like, absolutely, I would love to meet her. And so I actually met her in late 2019, a good long while ago. I wrote an article about her for The Cut, which came out in 2021. And then, but there was so much more to this story that I thought it needed to be a book, not just about Sarah's life, not even just about the remarkable legal battle and germination of this group, the Aggressive Christianity Missions Training Corps, but also these considerations about what does this group reveal about American religious history? What does it reveal about human nature and what we all need to survive?
Yeah. And I mean, I think so many stories of cults, that word I know is no longer really used. Yeah, it's fraught. It's just a good shorthand. Right. New religious movements, maybe. I think that experience when you get to talk to someone who has left, it's always a much more complicated experience, which you talk about in your article and we'll get into later, a much more complicated experience than this sudden lightning strike of understanding that everything you've ever believed is totally crazy and you're ready to go to the real world and you're not going to have to continue that battle day to day. So I think this is going to be a great example of what it really takes long term to, for lack of a better term, deprogram the self.
Absolutely. I was just going to say the book opens with the title character, Sarah Green, the Oracle's daughter, escaping the New Mexico compound where this group was located in the middle of the night, and then jumps back in time. But eventually when we pick back up with Sarah, one of the most interesting things that I learned about in reporting this book was how, as you said, she still felt caught between these worlds. She'd been desperate to escape this group because of the deprivations and restrictions that had guided her life there. But at the same time, her parents had founded this group 2 decades prior. She'd spent her entire life there. And so those initial years after her escape, and actually, many years after her escape, she was still trying to reconcile those two allegiances and desires in ways that were really complicated, but also to me as a writer, just like very narratively complicated and interesting because they were complicated.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we get into the narrative of this story, could you give us your kind of brief description of what this group entailed, what this group was, and then we'll get into it in a lot more detail.
Sure. So the group, as we mentioned before, was called the Aggressive Christianity Missions Training Corps, and it was founded in the early 1980s by a pair of ex-hippies who were at the time known as Jim and Lila Green. They'd been very big members of the counterculture. They were full-bore hippies. They had a conversion experience where they converted to Christianity and threw themselves just as hard into evangelical Christianity as once they'd been in the counterculture. In the initial years after their conversion, however, they felt like all the churches they visited were not intense enough. They wanted something much more aggressive, as the group ultimately was known. And so they started retreating. Lila, who eventually took the name Deborah, because that's what God told her to do, so I'll refer to her as Deborah, she started receiving visions. She said that God was telling her that, a great war was at hand and that she was going to be leading God's soldiers in this glorious conflagration and that she was going to give birth to thousands of spiritual children that would take over the world and all that kind of thing. And so in the early 1980s in Sacramento, she just was preaching on this like normal street corner in Sacramento and eventually started gaining followers because of the intensity and like wildness of her beliefs. The thing that was really interesting, though, is that it's actually very hard to pin down in some ways what were the belief systems of the group. Partially that's because Deborah was always receiving new visions from God, and maybe those new visions contradicted what she'd said earlier, but that's okay because this is what God is telling us most recently and blah, blah, blah. Also, they thought of themselves as a purely Christian group. They said that they were 100% Christians and that regular Christians were just 10% Christians. They were pew warmers, as they called them, who worshipped the one-eyed devil, as they called television. And so they would have said, we don't have a belief system that's like any different from what a regular, we're not practicing anything odd. We're just following the Bible to the letter. And that was actually really persuasive for some people who joined the group because they could kind of recognize the belief structures. And so when those belief structures were just kind of amped up to an 11, to a 211, there was still this recognizable element to it. And that was part of what, like I said, brought people in.
Okay. Wow. Yeah. So I mean, it's familiar in a lot of ways with its a very intense flavor. And it seems like these two, I'll say especially Deborah, maybe were intense from the beginning.
Oh, yeah. Very much so.
Will you tell us about their experience prior to this conversion, like back when they were hippies? I think that's, it's always interesting when a hippie goes the Jesus freak route and then, it just takes off from there. But they were involved in what was kind of like a type of movement early on.
Yeah, yeah. So the backgrounds of Jim and Lila / Deborah are so interesting. So I'll focus on, again, I'll call her Deborah because she's sort of the larger figure of the two.
Mm-hmm.
She grew up in the 1950s and 60s in West Sacramento, California, in a very, very poor family in a poor neighborhood, in a dirt road where her mother worked nights at an almond processing facility. Her father was not in the picture. She had several siblings and had to basically take care of them because her mom was not around. And so she'd grown up, in a world that was kind of tough. She just had to really provide for herself from a very, very young age. Then, after having been a very academically skilled young woman, she graduated from high school, enrolled in college, dropped out because she was pulled into the counterculture and was just like, I'm done with this. I want to be a hippie. I don't want to study. I'm letting my hair down. Literally, I want to let my hair down. And then when she was in her early 20s, her younger brother died. He died of cancer. It was very sudden, horrific. It just destroyed her. And I mean, in ways that are, she didn't know what to do. And so at that point, she heard about a back to the land hippie group in the woods outside of Sacramento that was called the Bear Tribe. And it was a group of native and non-native people who wanted to, reconnect with the land, reconnect with indigenous rituals and all that kind of stuff. And so Deborah just hurled herself into this group and really, as with everything in her life, she just did it to 100,000%. She'd run around without any clothes on. She allegedly freely slept around with other members. And then while she was in the group, she met this other member, a man who was basically just as intense as she was. And that was the man who would ultimately become her husband, Jim Green, who had come from a pretty normal background in Kentucky, but had come west in search of women and waves, as I say in the book. And he also lived a very hippie-ish life. At one point in a sermon I found, he said that he'd, quote, fornicated every woman he could jump on.
It's like a humble brag. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So they were just like really in it. And then when the Bear Tribe fell apart for various reasons that I get into in the book, they set out on their own, wandering the West, ending up in Montana, where Jim met an evangelist who converted him to Christianity. Same thing with Deborah, to the point of them being, going from one extreme to another. On the one hand, yeah, that's like a huge shift to go from like super hippie to super, I would say, pseudo-Christian. That's the term that I use.
Sure. But
on the other hand, there's like a real continuity to it as well. These are people who like love life to be lived at the absolute most intense that it can be lived. And that really, in a way, was like the major consistency in their lives completely from A to Z. I mean, even to today, like there's just this like abiding intensity that guided them, that helped them draw people in, that was part of what made them so charismatic and persuasive, and that frankly made them really productive and able to kind of found and operate a group of several dozen people, in the middle of the desert in New Mexico, which is where they ultimately landed after running into a bunch of legal trouble that I write about in the book.
That is really interesting that, because, it seems so incongruous to to go from the, like, what you, I guess, would say, like, was an extremely liberal leftist.
Yeah, for sure.
Movement, to like,
absolutely.
A super right wing, whether they were political or not, but I would say they probably were. But it makes sense, though, that what they were chasing ultimately was almost like feeling, like this depth of feeling.
Right.
And they could find that in different ways. And that's a really interesting idea that's what many cult leaders are probably seeking more than an ideology, is just this intensity of feeling that maybe without they feel like they don't exist or something. I mean, I can get that a little bit,
For sure.
I've been times in my life where I've been needing a lot more intensity than I do it now in my peaceful life when I watch The One-Eyed Devil every evening. Shame on me. So speaking to that intensity, tell us about what happened when Lila became Deborah. Mm-hmm. What was that lightning strike?
Yeah. So the group starts to build. It gets one member, it gets two members, it gets 10 members. And as it does, she and Jim purchased several adjoining houses on, as I said, this very regular street corner in Sacramento. And from the outside, it looks like a very regular, unremarkable street corner. But inside of it, every day, it's like erupting into this insane, basically kind of church. So the people in the group that they wrangled in, through the radio, through handing out tracts in the street, through word of mouth, all that kind of thing, they would meet every morning in the lower level of the main house, and they would have their first service of the day where they would undergo what they called deliverance, which was this wild kind of exorcism-like ritual where demons of all these different kind of sins, like, lust, envy, etc., all those kind of things, that they would be purged from people's bodies. But it wasn't just sort of recognizable sins like that. It was also things like nicotine or caffeine or whatever. If you were really into caffeine, if you're really into coffee, you might have a demon of caffeine. I guess I'm possessed in that case.
Caffeine demon is some kind of a band name or something.
Exactly. Yeah. But so they would, they said you could have up to 6,000 demons in you at a time. And so...
Wow, there was a ceiling.
There was a ceiling. I mean, that's what they said. But again, they would kind of change the rules and the teachings constantly. Right. So, that's what they said in like 1984.
Okay. All right. That was the ceiling then.
Yeah. But, then they would have their meals. They would all wear the same clothes, sitting at the tables and sing their songs. The group wrangled in a very wealthy businessman in Sacramento who owned some frame and art shops. And so he would employ the members of the group at these frame and art shops, and that's how they made a lot of their money at the beginning. And they would, work there all day. They would come back. At the end of the day, they would do another service. They would make dinner. They would do another service after that. So it was just this kind of totally exhausting rhythm of days, which was a big way that Deborah was able to keep people cemented into the group, and which is how many leaders of these kind of groups keep people involved. You're just kind of too exhausted, too busy, too overwhelmed to be able to have really meaningful reflection on maybe what's wrong or what's missing in your life. Yeah, so it was just this wild rhythm that took place every day. And then, as the years went by, the group became more and more militaristic. They said that they were just reading the letter of the law in the Bible, which, there are certainly many parts of the Bible that use like militaristic language. Mm-hmm. There are also many parts of the Bible that are all about peace and love and forgiveness and all those kind of things. They really, though, leaned on the hardcore militaristic stuff. Yeah. And so as part of that, they would order military uniforms from the Army Navy store. They would have these like pinning ceremonies where they would get elevated to a sergeant or a first lieutenant or whatever. But these were not literal, they weren't in the army or whatever, but they said that they were in the army of God. And so that was how they really tried to think of it. It was that it wasn't really metaphorical. It was that they were literally in a war. And as such, they needed to be, have the titles of people who were engaged in a war.
Did they have like a familial military background, or like how did they design this? What was the inspiration aside from just the language in the Bible?
So as Jim explained at one point along the way, he had spent some time I believe it was the reserve in the late 1960s, but ultimately quit because he didn't want to be told what to do, that kind of thing. But at the same time, he always loved the military aesthetic, like the vibe. Okay. He just was really into it. And there was an element of dress up to this that he was really into, which actually speaks to something that I found so interesting about this group and that I write about a lot in the book, which is that on the one hand, this was a deadly serious enterprise. This group was they were really intense about what they believed. They subjected people to lots of mistreatment because of those beliefs. They were 100% into what they were doing. And yet at the same time, you kind of step back and it's 5 a.m. It's a regular street corner in Sacramento. And they're 30 adults dressed up in military uniforms, running around in the basement, slashing the air with invisible demon slaying swords. It's kind of ridiculous and almost kind of comical.
Yeah.
And that simultaneity was part of what made me so excited to write the book and just to try and wrestle with that. And, as with so many things, extreme things in culture, those really coexist.
Yeah.
Things that produce great evil in the world are not necessarily exclusively dark. And that's part of what makes them that much more destructive, is that they can kind of hide behind this like veneer of ridiculousness.
Yeah. Yeah. And it does seem like every new religious movement, or kind of even like if you look at fraternal orders, which, you know, are largely benign, but like these like groups that have this exclusivity, that are like shrouded in some kind of mystery or privacy or separateness, they love a fucking costume. They love a like fit. They got to find it. And it is like, it does speak to this almost like burlesque, like,
I love that
version of what it means to be who they are. It's like they have to dress themselves up into what they are imagining themselves to be. And I do think that that is so goofy. But it feels like it's just a big part of maybe that like group fusion too. You know, it's so funny and so strange.
I love what you said, burlesque. You know, the word that I use in the book at one point at the end is military drag. You know, they're like,
drag burlesque. I was thinking drag too. It's a fine line. Yeah.
And like, again, it's like, it's ridiculous, but I also really understand it. And this was actually part of what I wanted to really emphasize in the book, which is that like the impulses that lead these people and members of the groups, leaders of the groups, to do these wild things, these are recognizable impulses that all human beings to some extent share, or at least that's what I believe.
Yeah.
And, you know, there's a reason that, you know, many schools have uniforms, many sort of places of work don't have like, people don't wear the exact same clothes, but they wear the exact same kinds of clothes. And I think I for one, quite like uniforms in some way. I like being absolved with this like burden of having to like choose my clothes every day. And there's also something really pleasurable about just releasing yourself into a group and not having to like parade your individuality every day. And that contradiction, I think, is just at the center of being a human being. We want to be ourselves. We want to be individual. We want to be seen as exactly who we are and recognized for our specificity. We also want to like let it go, be told what to wear, just sit down in a group, sing songs with a group, eat the same food, and, you know, join a soccer team, join like a sewing club, join a theater group, join a chorus. You know, these are impulses that speak to that desire for collective. And those groups are kind of healthy way of expressing that desire. And a group like the Aggressive Christianity Missions Training Corps or other groups that I would call cults, you know, they are, let's just say, not so positive expressions of that impulse.
Right. And I mean, I think something that speaks to what you're saying too is the idea of the charismatic leader, which is what Deborah was. And I think we've talked about this on the show before, but people have kind of a misunderstanding about what a charismatic leader is, because they're like, oh, they don't have any charisma. And it's like, really what a charismatic leader does is presents a total confidence in their vision.
Yes.
Like there's no room for any doubt. And man, wouldn't it be nice to just hand over your doubt and your fear and everything, all that uncertainty to just some person? I mean, we know what that's like now in this country as well. But I think that is another big part of the experience of this uniform. You're part of this group. You're fading away. Your individuality is no longer a stressor to you. You don't have to wake up and say, what do I think about this? What do I think about this? What do I do moving forward? You just get to release that to somebody else. And I can understand that appeal. I absolutely can.
Absolutely. I mean, I couldn't agree more. I think that conviction is at the core of charisma. I think part of what made the leaders of this group so effective, in particular Deborah, was that she truly believed what she was saying. I mean, only she can say whether or not she truly believed it. But for my interpretation of spending years researching this group, I really believe that she believed it.
Yeah.
And we're attracted to people who really believe stuff. That's appealing, you know? We like to be around people who are sure of themselves. Another element of charisma that I think I would mention also, at least as it applies to these leaders, is that they were both physically very attractive. They were both kind of beautiful in their own ways. Yeah.
I have to look at them.
Yeah. I mean, by the time by the present day, I mean, I wouldn't say that they're gorgeous people. Also, years of fasting doesn't help anyone.
Yeah.
Yeah. But they were extraordinarily beautiful people. And, you know, there's a reason, like the cover of the book is this like huge photograph of Sarah Green, the main character of the book, the daughter of Jim and Deborah. And, you know, you sort of get a sense of it. She's extraordinarily beautiful as well.
She's stunning. She's really stunning. Yeah. More after this. And now back to the show. Well, maybe this is a good time to kind of introduce Sarah a little bit, because she obviously is the centerpiece of your story and someone really caught between, I think, the desire for individuality and selfhood and the desire to remain part of a group. That was all she really knew. So tell us a little bit about Sarah. Like, what was her role in the group? What was her upbringing like? And, you know, bring us up to kind of where she got to when she realized it was time to go.
Yeah, Sarah was born in the early 1970s, and she was maybe 6 or 7 years old when her mom started receiving visions from God. And so what that meant was that even though she was still young when this was happening, she remembered a time in her life when things had been relatively normal, which would ultimately be enormously important for her in her ability to find a new life, because she would know something of what she was missing when the group became more and more intense. Of course, that's what happened in the years that followed. Deborah began to draw in more and more members. And as she did, Sarah grew more and more despondent and depressed. And as she became a teenager, she even tried to commit suicide. She was just desperate to reconnect with the life that she had known only as a little girl. Sarah is like an extremely compelling figure. She's funny, she's wry, she's sarcastic. She has this extraordinary zest for life. I mean, she loves to run, she loves plants, she just loves seeing things and discovering things. And so that's just sort of who she is. Yeah. And that, of course, that clashes in a huge way with life in a group such as the Aggressive Christianity Missions Training Corps. So she becomes a young woman. She's married off effectively to a man in the group that she doesn't love. She has 2 children with him that she loves profoundly, deeply. She's a very devoted mother. And yet at the same time, as she enters her mid-20s, she begins to feel like, if I don't leave now, I'm never going to get out. Part of her initial motivation was, you know, I want to go to the outside world and establish a life for myself that I can then go back to the compound and bring my kids out and start over with them. And I should mention, by this point, the group was living in the desert of New Mexico. As I said earlier, they'd fled California for various reasons. So at the age of 26 in 1999, in the middle of a cool, slightly breezy night outside of Fence Lake, New Mexico, Sarah and another recent member ran away. They brought a backpack each, hitchhiked down the road, and made their way west. Sarah ultimately ended up north in Seattle. And I won't say too much about how her life unfolded from there, because that's a hugely important part of the book. But what I'll say generally is that Sarah was able to come to some kind of resolution. I don't think I'm giving too much away to say that. She was a huge participant in this book, and I interviewed her dozens and dozens of times. And I hope that people reading the book can take from it, among many other things, I hope that they can take some measure of hope and, frankly, inspiration from her, because she was able to actually get out and start over. At the same time, this was like real life. This wasn't some sort of storybook happy ending. There were huge losses. There was huge trauma. She struggles with stuff still today. There is a kind of ambivalence to some of the ending. And yet at the same time, she is out. She does have her own life.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, what an incredible, it's just something I can't even begin to fathom, what that would actually be like. And I mean, I know there are like so many more intricate moments to her life. I mean, maybe we can get into her, she had her, I believe, 2 children while she was inside the cult. And then she also, quote unquote, I guess, adopted a child as well, which I know is a big part of the story. So could you explain to us what happened there?
Yeah, yeah. Again, sort of speaking in kind of general terms, because I don't want to give too much away. What I'll say is that when Sarah was in her early 20s, at the direction of her mother, she was involved in this truly shocking, elaborate child trafficking scheme where the crimes took place in Kampala in Uganda. There was a child that was brought back to the US, and that child was raised by Sarah for the first few years of that child's life. When Sarah left the compound in 1999 at the age of 26, she left both of her biological children and this child that was trafficked from Uganda. And that child, in the years that followed after Sarah left, while Sarah was not around, that child allegedly suffered extraordinary abuse, and just the struggle to survive was really profound and really real. At the same time, those experiences and her willingness to ultimately speak about them were a huge part of bringing this group to some kind of at least partial justice. The subtitle of the book is The Rise and Fall of an American Cult. So there is a kind of fall that happens there, and there's a big trial and whatever. But that woman, that, originally child and now a young woman, was, in some ways the consummate victim of the story, and also the heroine.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, as you said, there is so much to learn about the trial and about what happened, because, we aren't going to get into it because we generally don't do too much of that on the show. And I know there's so much that you want to keep for those who are able to read the book, but there was a lot of abuse that happened in this group. And I think that it speaks to some of the very strange contradictions that happen in groups like this, where you can be preaching a certain doctrine, with every part of your being, but then you can also reason away some of the things that maybe should be considered sinful. And I know that's hard because the Bible, everyone on this show knows I've been reading the Bible cover to cover for the first time.
Amazing.
It is brutal. It is very brutal.
A lot
just
there.
Wild. Yeah, a lot there. I haven't got to the New Testament yet. I'm waiting for that oasis.
Quite different. I will say quite different.
Yeah, it's got its own issues, sure, but quite different. But, I think that I am interested in the way that Deborah kind of shifted and changed and allowed new ideas into the group. Could you talk about how was it that she received this information, or believed she received this information in general from God?
Yeah, in a way, it was just very straightforward. She would just walk into her prayer closet, as she called it, and get down on the floor and listen. And she said that God was speaking to her. And sometimes when this happened during meetings, she would start speaking in tongues, that kind of thing.
Sure.
And that was kind of it. She believed she had a direct pathway to God. And, it's interesting because, as you know from reading the Bible, there's a lot of that in the Bible, of people, of prophets. I mean, prophets it's not an unprecedented thing. It's actually a hugely important part of, basically every religion.
Yeah.
And so in one sense, you or I hear, oh, that woman, she says she's a prophet. And it's very easy to kind of roll your eyes and be like, oh yeah, sure. So am I. And yet at the same time, if you're reading the Bible in a really serious way, and you see all these prophets that are, chosen by God in this book, and this other woman who's very convincing, very beautiful, very full of conviction, comes up and says, I'm a prophet too. It's not like someone saying, hey, let's get on a spaceship and go to Mars. Right. They're saying, this is continuous with what you know about.
Yeah.
So you should listen to me.
Yeah. And I think that for those of us, I know I am one of them, who didn't grow up with any strong religious overtones. For me, prophet, I'm like, oh my God. But you're right. It's if for much of Western culture and many cultures now, that is fully the reality. And even if you're only partially in that, you have this script. You have this thing, like you said, it's not, oh, like the aliens, I'm following the comet in my spaceship. It's, I am part of a lineage of something that has a very solid tradition already in existence. So it makes sense that wouldn't be a huge turnoff for people who are already there in their minds. So that's really something, though. And just the way that if you say you're a prophet, I mean, we talked about this a little bit in our last episode on the history of Hobby Lobby and the Hobby Lobby family, which also last name of Green, which is kind of weird.
I wonder if they're related. I doubt they're related.
Yeah, I think that this idea that they weren't necessarily receiving revelations or anything, but they were taking the Bible, they were taking these ideas and kind of deciding what they meant and being like, well, it doesn't mean that because I'd really like to do that. So maybe if I, put it this way, I can kind of slip through. And I wonder how much, how conscious someone like Deborah is of these choices, or if it really is just something happens in your mind and you decide, oh, I had a thought, I guess that's a revelation because I had I don't know. Do you know what I'm saying? It's hard to even put into words. Just what is that experience? Did you find any insight into that?
I mean, it's sort of the how do you distinguish between seeing what you want to see and seeing what is actually there? I mean, it's very difficult. And if in some situations it's kind of impossible. Yeah. I mean, what to say that,
I know it's hard.
I'm sort of flummoxed because there kind of is no answer.
Right.
I think it just goes back a little bit to what you were saying about charisma earlier, that the conviction and sincerity of belief, it just does a lot of work. If there's this sort of mist of doubt in the air, it can really put holes in any kind of ideological argument that a group is making.
And I imagine that it's the same exact thing for her. She has to be absolutely confident in herself. Right. Or it crumbles away too, which is pretty scary.
I do wonder, in the way she presented herself, she's absolutely a full bore believer. And I think she was, as I was saying earlier. But you also do wonder, were there moments when it's 4 a.m. and she's lying in there in bed and she's about to get up and start prophesying, and does she wonder, is this right? Am I actually chosen by God? And there's something kind of weirdly almost touching about that idea to me. It's like this sort of little glimmer of humanity underneath what's a pretty rough and punitive exterior.
Yeah, yeah. So something we haven't really talked about was I know their beliefs were a little difficult to truly parse out and catalog, but did they have a goal? Did they have a vision for the world in a greater sense? Because they were an army. Did they have an idea that they were going to enact this upon the world in some way? Or were they just happy to hang back and have their kind of perfect community?
Yeah, no hanging back for sure. I mean, they believed that they were an elite class of soldiers that was going to wage spiritual warfare and basically usher in the great conflagration of the end of the world that would redeem the world and lead to everyone, the saints going to heaven. So no, the ambitions were extraordinarily grandiose and large, and there was no sense of let's make a little community and go from there. I mean, at most, this group was maybe in the 40-some people. For most of its life, it was in the 20s, which is to say it was not very successful at all.
Yeah.
But they would go, the group got some newspaper coverage in the years that it was around, and they would go to these reporters and they would say, we have roughly 700,000 members worldwide. And it's just you just don't. I mean, the group, what I will say is that they had a very robust missionary program. They traveled all over the world. They would go, to, as I mentioned, Uganda, India, East Africa, West Africa, all over the place. And so as part of those travels, they were able to kind of rope people into these kind of satellites of the group. It's debatable how devoted these groups were after Jim and Deborah left. I think that they were probably not very devoted at all. But interestingly, there's a lot of photographic evidence of real conviction, because some of these people, they would walk around, they'd be in Nairobi, there'd be photographs from Nairobi with people wearing these shirts that said Aggressive Christianity Missions Training Corps. And maybe it wasn't Nairobi, but many, many countries where they have these photographs. So no, it was, it couldn't have been more grand. And again, that speaks to this bizarre mixture of seriousness and ridiculousness. They're like, we're at war. This is, it could not be more serious. And then it's like, they're saying they have like hundreds of thousands of members, and you just have to kind of roll your eyes a little bit, it's sort of too much.
Yeah. Exaggeration is a very important part of kind of authoritarian movements, I think, as we see. Got to have those big crowds, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So you have talked about Deborah being a true believer and Jim being a true believer, and this sort of evangelical principle of spreading this message far and wide. Do you feel that any of this was a grift, or do you feel like this was full? Like, were they making money? Were they bringing in donations? Is there any part of this to you that felt insincere, or do you just think it was a true dedication?
It's such a good question. No one's really asked me that before. I should start first by saying how the group made money, because I think that does shed light on some of this.
Yeah.
At the beginning, as I was saying earlier, they were employed by this local businessman in Sacramento who had these frame and art shops. And so they just generated income from there. And that was some pretty meaningful income. In the late 1980s, they were sued by a former member and so had to go on the run. Mm-hmm. They lost their main source of income because of that. They had to leave Sacramento. They couldn't work at these shops anymore. And so they started this peddling business where they would just make breads and snacks and whatever, and they would find like expired Hostess snacks and resell them, in the trash can. Some of these horrifying things. They would find like expired Hostess cakes that people had slashed little cuts in the bottom of them to show that they were expired. And then this group, the members, they would like take Scotch tape and they would like tape them up. And then they would go to the side of the road and be like, here's some Hostess cakes. Anyways, that's how they made their money then. They made some furniture, and they made money through that. Most meaningfully, however, because they ultimately bought huge tracts of land in New Mexico. There was a member who was Sarah's husband while in the group, mm-hmm. whose parents allegedly bankrolled much of the operation. They were very wealthy, and they, for reasons that just are beyond me, they supported this operation. And then to your question about like, was this a grift? Again, only they can know the answer, but I don't think it was at all. I don't think there was a speck of grift, because they said they'd taken vows of poverty, and, they really did. They fasted all the time. They ate very, very poorly. They had no indulgences or anything, like floss or crackers or whatever. They weren't allowed to do anything. And because all of the money needed to go towards, for example, the missionary work, and, they would get used clothes and send them abroad to people in need. And the money did cycle through. I mean, some readers might disagree with me, but I think, again, it speaks to the level of conviction that was at play.
Yeah, it's so strange, because I always go back to an episode we did, which I even talked about this last episode too, on the Westboro Baptist Church, mm-hmm. and then another episode on Megan Phelps Roper leaving the church, and just how true of a conviction those people held. Yep. And they expressed it in a very, a way that we feel is very revolting. I feel is very revolting.
I mean, I will agree with you there.
Yeah, sure. But really getting into, which I imagine you did, their belief structure and understanding how they came to it. I can't comprehend ever believing that, but seeing the process of that belief, and seeing that in the case of Westboro as well, it wasn't really a grift. I thought when I got into it, I was like, certainly this will contain an element of dishonesty or an attempt to, whatever. But they were so exclusionary, which maybe this group seems to be too, or maybe it was just not attractive.
They were exclusionary, but they also needed new members. I mean, they're sort of both going on at the same time. I mean, I'm so struck by what you were saying. There's something wild about that. The fact that the people in the Westboro Baptist Church, the people in this group that I wrote about, that they believed this stuff with such conviction. But it also it's a little chilling to me because, I mean, I really believe that like human beings, like we share a lot of the same machinery, and that like, it makes me just wonder, what are the things what are the assumptions I'm operating off of, or that broader society is operating off of that are just really wrong, and that only like reveal themselves as like wrong, through various things. The quote at the very beginning of the book, the epigraph, it's a quote from the philosopher William James in his book, The Varieties of Religious Experience, which is an incredible book. But the quote is, "The sanest and best of us are of one clay with lunatics and prison inmates." And so the idea there that he's saying is that like, we're not as different as we would like to think we are, that, the sanest and best, lunatics and prison inmates, that we're more tightly enmeshed than we might like to think.
Yeah.
That's kind of the central argument of the book, I think, is that like, these people in this group were doing wild stuff, crazy stuff. And yet at the same time, I think the thought processes that led people to doing these things are not wholly alien. They're the impulses that lead people to like join a chorus or whatever. They're not entirely dissimilar from the things that make people join these kind of groups. And, I'm sure your listeners have heard all the crazy stats about how like, 2/3 of cult members come from like very ordinary middle-class backgrounds. Yeah. And it's very hard to believe it, and yet I've looked at the studies. It is really true. And so all of this stuff is much closer than we like to think.
More after this. And now back to the show.
I should also mention, in the book, I'm really trying to position this group within a broader conversation about both American religious history and just like how cults work and stuff. So part of the argument as well is that like, the mainstream in American religious history is not so far away from the extreme in American religious history. And that there's all this overlap from the very founding of the country. There's this porousness at play there that I find just like totally fascinating. And I don't say that to like malign mainstream religion at all, just to say that, again, there is this like chilling similarity at play, to the point that right now, the group is, at least what remains of it on their website, they're like obsessed with Trump. Mm-hmm. The things that the group says online they're just not that dissimilar from some of the things that much more mainstream evangelical Christians say about Trump as well. And it's sort of, to me, quite alarming and chilling. And also, I think, helps make the point that I'm trying to show that again, like we're closer than we like to think.
And, another group I think of, do you know about the Ramtha School of Enlightenment? Did that ever come across your research?
It's not ringing a bell, but tell me about it. It's not
ringing a bell. Yeah. And it might not have, because it's not at least as far as I know at this point, it has not been in the past a Christian new religious group. But the leader of that group has been accused of a lot of different things. And that group also swung really hard toward Trump in a way that was pretty unexpected, because I would say that they are much more in like the New Age tradition.
Yeah.
Well, it's so fascinating that like a charismatic leader almost is looking for their own charismatic leader.
Yeah.
Because it's like, it must be hard to be the one that knows everything. It must be, it must be taxing every day to be the prophet.
What is the Shakespeare, like heavy is the head that wears the crown, whatever the Shakespeare quote is. I mean, heavy is the whatever that wears the prophet thing.
Yeah, whatever. The little prophet hat, the military uniform.
Exactly,
the burlesque the military
beret.
Uniform. Yeah,
the military beret.
Exactly. But I mean, it is interesting that like, I'm sure that this is true of so many different, ones we know of and ones we don't out there of these types of groups. And I don't know, I've never really thought about Trump as the charismatic leader's charismatic leader.
Yeah.
It makes sense in a way that you even those people are looking for someone who is certain.
Right.
And like you're talking about with this idea that we're not so far from, the most extreme elements of society. I really just think that's true, because it is really hard to wake up every day and to make decisions,
Yeah.
find what your beliefs are, challenge your beliefs. I mean, that's what this show has done for me every day of my life, is like, even my most deeply held beliefs, I like am picking apart and I'm like, am I sure I believe them? Where is that coming from?
Right.
It's taxing.
That's hard.
It's scary. It's hard.
Yeah. It's destabilizing.
It
if you've
is.
sort of built parts of your life on certain ideas and then you kind of decide, oh, I'm going to like look down and prod them,
Yeah.
That's not a nice feeling.
No, it's not.
That what that's making me think about also is that there's also a very uniquely American part of this. And I should say to begin with, that cults are not at all a simply American phenomenon,
Sure.
Not remotely. But there's a kind of American valence to some of them, which is that the social safety net here in the US is much thinner than it is in many other countries. And so there are a lot of people who are going to be really attracted to someone who says, let me give you a meal. Let me give you a place to stay.
Yeah.
Let me give you a job. These are practical things. These are not emotional or spiritual. It's just a kind of material comfort. And then if you just are in the building because you've been given free housing, you're just that much more likely to be roped in. That was something that I found just tremendously interesting and was a kind of aha moment. I was like, right, of course, if it's that much harder to get kind of public benefits, if there's someone on a corner handing out literature and saying like, come by and get some chicken soup tonight, you might tell yourself, oh, I'm not going to listen to the sermon, but I'm going to get the soup and then I'll just like leave. But maybe the sermon's kind of interesting. And then you go back again and, blah, blah, blah. You can kind of take it from there.
It's like when you sign up to go to a timeshare thing and they're like giving you some free shit. And you're like, I'm just going to stay for an hour. Yes. I'm just going to take this free shit. No, but much more serious.
It's me with like a streaming service. It's like, oh, I'm just going to subscribe for 1 month and watch this show. Yeah. And then you're like, okay, but like that other show. Oh, I didn't finish the season. Oh, but it's kind of nice. And then
right. Yes, those are our much more innocuous versions of this. But it's it is. It's like there are so many ways to fall into something that gives you a sense of like being lulled a little bit, like being held by something, whether that something is providing you with food and shelter or certainty and power. And it makes, I don't know. I have a lot of space for that attempt to understand why people, whether it is religious or political, why people are in, why they get in, why they can't get out. And, a large part of that is the loss of the people that you've put around yourself. Like, if you are part of a movement like that, chances are your family, your friends, everyone you know to a degree shares that belief system. And so getting out the way that Sarah had to is being alone. It is like leaving everything. And it's really hard to do. So, kind of as like our last thing we're getting into, would you, and I know you don't want to give too much away, but would you talk a little bit about just that conflict that Sarah had to go through that we kind of mentioned in the beginning of the missing the group, wondering if she made the right choice, and then kind of how it felt to just be out?
Yeah. I mean, again, this was just one of the most interesting things to me in all the reporting. As part of the legal case and ultimately trial that's at the end of the book, there was a ton of discovery, which basically means like the accumulation of documents that are relevant to the case. And some of the documents that came out in the course of discovery were letters and emails between Sarah and Deborah after she had left the group.
Wow.
So this is from, 1999 until like 2016 or something like that. And, it's one thing to talk to Sarah about those years, which I did in great detail and got amazing and fascinating details. But it's another thing to read contemporaneous letters and emails where you can just see this conflict happening and these just competing priorities and ideas at play. Sarah would say things like, I'm a terrible person. I'm the worst person. Only like Jesus isn't going to take mercy on me. All these like very kind of religiously inflected things. And yet she wouldn't come back. She didn't want to come back. Yeah. If you were to read that letter or that email, you might go, this sounds like somebody who's like literally about to get on a plane and come back and just rejoin. And yet she didn't do that. it was also partially, it was the front she was presenting to her mother. But the conflict was so real. I mean, one of the details that I love the most is that I heard from one of Sarah's friends when she first escaped the group, someone she met from working at a cafe, is that Sarah would sometimes write home and ask for a stack of evangelizing tracts. So these like multicolored documents that people would put out at bus stops on, just out on the street, trying to get people to repent and join the cult. So Sarah is like, she's starting over. She's going to Halloween parties. She's like hanging out with her friends at a gay bar. She's going to a rave, whatever. And she's also writing home and saying like, please give me a stack of paper that yells about the one-eyed devil television and like, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And she would actually go and put them out around town. She would do it. And, I asked her a lot about it. And like, there kind of is no answer to the question of why, other than she'd grown up with this stuff. And it's very hard to shake yourself of it, even if you can recognize, as she was able to recognize, that there's so much abuse going on, even if you are so desperate to get away from it that you like run away in the middle of the night, you leave everything you've ever known and you hightail it up to the Pacific Northwest. Even for someone with that kind of gumption to get up and go, those forces are still at play. I just find that totally interesting and like so human. It feels like that is just at the center of what it is to be a human being, which is to say to have these just like competing ideas within all of us that we act on some, we don't act on others. And what we do is often we contradict ourselves, Yeah. What is like the Whitman quote? What, do I contradict myself? Yes, I contradict myself. I mean, that is like how at least that's how I believe. That's something at the core of what human beings are. It's contradiction.
Absolutely. I think that hopefully all of you out there feel that way, or you might be a cult leader.
And if you don't, let me know. And like, maybe we can, banish the contradiction in our lives as well.
Absolutely. So at the end of this process and where you are now, I mean, you have finished this project in a way. What do you feel like you took from it in terms of maybe how we approach? And again, I ask this question to a lot of people. It's a big question, so take it where you want. But what have you learned from this that you feel you could maybe apply to our moment in politics and religion when we see a lot of people who maybe, I would say, I've seen it recently, one foot out a little bit of Trumpism. And I know that's not what your book's about. I mean, it's in there. But it sounds like it's a little bit what your book's about, right?
The end, I didn't want him to be in the book, but he had to be in the book because this group is so into him,
I think that it is important to me to kind of just at least talk about like, what do we do here when we're starting to see this facade crack and we're starting to see people where there's a glimmer of hope there. I mean, what have you learned from this book that is kind of leading your thinking on that now?
Yeah, I'm sort of two minds, because on the one hand, I did all this research into and saw how, seeing evidence of bad things in your life, it just does not necessarily mean you're going to give them up. I just saw this over and over and over again, that like logic doesn't necessarily change people.
And experiencing, even like you said, like the abuses that we didn't get into in this episode, but they experience a lot of profound abuse. And in a way, people are experiencing a different kind of abuse, I think, that is a little more insidious and under the surface. But anyway. For sure. Yeah. So on the one hand, it makes me sort of throw my hands up a little bit and I say like, well, if the people in this group, which was extraordinarily abusive, couldn't kind of accurately see their situation, then what hope is there for our current political moment? And yet at the same time, some of these people in this book did get out. I mean, plenty of them did get out. It's not just Sarah. There are other people. There are different ways that people do escape these extremist ideologies. There's a chapter in the book about some of this, about how there's this thing called exit counseling, which is a surprisingly effective process by which somebody who is in an extremist group, generally like a kind of physically isolated kind of group, leaves that physical isolation and meets with a counselor
who kind of confronts them with things that they loved in their prior life. Maybe that's like, music albums, books, TV shows, or whatever. And that through that process, and these people are trained in this and they kind of know what to ask and how to help people kind of connect the dots of their own abuse, that it's actually extremely effective. It's like shockingly effective. It's just that changing the circumstances, my read of it at least, is that, getting that person out of the situation, that's the big hurdle. I mean, the metaphor that I use in the book is that it's like an ice cube that's frozen in a freezer. If it's just in that freezer, it's going to be frozen, but you take it out and put it in the sunlight. I mean, it's going to start to melt immediately. Yeah. A change in circumstances really can facilitate a change in thinking and identity. So I guess, we were talking about contradiction. Those ideas are both that I just gave you are kind of in contradiction, a kind of hopelessness on the one hand and a hope on the other. But I think there's truth in both of them. I don't know. I'd ask you the same question. What do you think of how do we see our ways out of some of the extremism of our current moment?
Oh, boy. I really liked the moment and in our conversation where you talked about Sarah's tether back to something that resembled normalcy for her. Yes. And, you just talked about it again. And I do think that's just something I haven't really thought about. We've talked about and thought about giving someone a landing place. And again, I always like to caveat that no one needs to give anyone a landing place. No one needs to forgive. No one needs to welcome people back into their lives. Doesn't matter what you do. I'm talking about myself here and where I think that I have strengths. And I do think that allowing people the chance to change no matter what they have believed in the past is a net positive. We get someone out, we get someone on our side, whatever.
Right.
So
right.
I just like to
both true.
slam that caveat out. But, I think that idea, that tether to normalcy is really powerful, because if you have someone in your life that used to be really different before getting involved in this current movement, there is a tether back to that. It's like, hey, remember when you didn't feel this way? I know there's a power to feeling certain, and there's a power to feeling, you're right, and you're on the right team, and you're on the winning team of America, which I think is largely what a lot of this is about, is wanting to just win.
Right.
If you tether back to man, remember when I could hang out with members of my family and it felt normal, or when I didn't feel I didn't wake up and start watching this news network that makes me feel so angry and it just this sourness that must live inside a person to continue to eat this stuff up. It's it must be awful. It must just feel good. Awful, and it feels awful to be scared, man. It feels awful to wake up and be what the hell is going to happen today? Am I a terrorist today? All that stuff is so scary and so real. And so is this I can't imagine that it's not just the millstone around the neck. I can't imagine that it's not this deep kind of the word that just comes to mind is just this sourness inside. Yeah. And I just wonder if trying to tether people back to that's why I'm really interested in James Talarico. This is a total aside, but he's a Christian, a Protestant Christian who is speaking biblically to people. He's speaking about the Bible in a language that people know. And it's what if you were offered this other way to be Christian? It just feels what a amazing thing to have. Wouldn't you like to choose to feel a lot of love in your heart and help people? Doesn't that feel nice? What an alternative to offer to people who need that structure. They need Jesus Christ and religion, and they also are living in this version of it that must feel really bad a lot of the time. And I just wonder, if that is going to do anything, offering people a softer version of what they believe, if they're not ready to step out entirely. I mean, as we've talked about, it's that's extremely difficult. And these incremental things you can offer, I think, have power if you're someone who feels called to do that.
Yeah, I agree. Yes.
Cool. It's a hard one. I don't know. We can give our speeches and our hopes and dreams all day long, and we know that it's hard. It's a really hard question, and it's just like you said. Some people can get out. I don't have hope for everyone, but I have hope for some people, and that's where I land on this for sure. So, Harrison, this was a great conversation. Thank you for sharing this story and for giving me all of your thoughts and for writing this book. What a process. Thank you for, giving Sarah a chance to tell her story and to teach us a little bit about what this movement and what so many movements are like. I really appreciate you being on the show.
Thank you so much, Chelsea. A real treat, and I really enjoyed the conversation.
This was American Hysteria. Make sure you pick up a copy of Harrison's book, The Oracle's Daughter, The Rise and Fall of an American Cult. You can find a link in our episode notes. If you want to support our show and make sure that we can continue to create it, you can become a patron at patreon.com/American Hysteria or by subscribing on Apple Plus. Not only will you get ad-free episodes, but you'll also get access to Hysteria Home Companion, the other podcast that I make with our producer Miranda, where we tell you stories related to the topics that we cover and stories that we just know that you'll love. That's patreon.com/American Hysteria or subscribe on Apple Plus. If you go to AmericanHysteria.com, you could pick up some of our merch. 100% of those profits go to the Samir Project, a Palestinian-led mutual aid group in Gaza. You can also leave us a message on the Urban Legends hotline about a tale that you remember from growing up or one you've heard recently, and we might do an entire investigation about it. American Hysteria's producer and editor is Miranda Zickler. Our associate producer is Riley Swedelius-Smith. This episode has additional editing by Kaylee Jasperson, and I'm your host, Chelsea Weber-Smith. Thanks, as always, for listening, and I hope you have a great week.